I have clicked onto the global tropical overview for July the 31st, 2024. As is always the case in these videos, the flood pressure are mine alone. If you're going to make any decisions ahead of any tropical cyclones, look to your local office, local emergency management, and local tropical cyclone warning center. So we have several systems to watch across the East Pacific and the Atlantic today. We've got 3 in the East Pacific, which are all given fairly decent odds of becoming a tropical cyclone. In fact, we have one now, Tropical Depression 3, off the coast of Mexico. And we've also got a tropical wave here in the Leeward Islands of the Caribbean, which is forecast to make its way west towards the U.S. southeast coast and could develop into a storm once it gets there as we get into this weekend and early next week. We're going to focus mainly today on the Atlantic system, but we're going to briefly start with the East Pacific systems, as these are systems that are not going to be impacting land. We're not expecting any landfalls in Central America or Mexico from these, but it's worth touching on as the East Pacific has been very quiet this whole hurricane season. The season started over 2 months ago on May 15th, and so far we've had 2 tropical storms form at the time of this recording. Now, we're probably going to get our next one either later today or early tomorrow, but at this time, 2 tropical storms on July 31st, that's within some of the most inactive seasons on record, and we've had no hurricanes so far. Now, that is likely to change as we have 2 systems that are candidates to become hurricanes. In fact, one could easily become a major hurricane in its track. If you look at the tropical weather outlook from the National Hurricane Center, going left to right on things, we've got Invest 95E. This is a little bit of a low pressure system west of Tropical Depression 3. You can sort of pick it out on satellite imagery here. This does have some limitations in its environment. You can see just northwest of it, we've got some stratocumulus clouds indicating a more stable environment as the 26-degree isotherm crosses just northwest of where the low is positioned. And this could act as a good entry point for more stable air to entrain the system's center as it develops. But also its issue is Tropical Depression 3 further east of it. If we look at the GFS upper level wind flow, you can see as the system develops, this is Tropical Depression 3, and as it intensifies, it begins to get an upper level cyclone bringing a lot of shear surrounding it. And if we look west of the storm, we've got easterly flow stretching away from it, and we've got Invest 95E here on the map. And this ends up bringing a lot of northeasterly flow right towards the system. And this shears it apart, not overly high shear, but that coupled with the more stable environment off towards northwest will likely cause issues for it. Now, it's still possible, of course, with that low that it already has, that develops into a weak tropical storm out there, but the good news is it's mainly an interest to shipping out there. It will not be impacting any land areas, and it will likely not make it very far into the Central Pacific if it even does make it there. Now, we've also got a system behind Tropical Depression 3. This is a disturbance forming right now near Central America, and this is already given an 80% chance of development from the National Hurricane Center. A very aggressive number, but rightfully so, as models are very aggressive on this system, wanting it to become potentially a major hurricane here. And I see why. You can see that this system develops on the GFS model fairly quickly, and it has a healthy upper level high, bringing a low shear environment right over the warmest waters that we have in the East Pacific. The issue Tropical Depression 3 has is it's forming pretty far west, and the warmest waters are right about here. So it's on the western end of those warmest waters, and it's a little bit more broad, so it needs time to develop its inner core structure to be able to intensify significantly. And that's going to take quite a bit of its real estate over the warm waters in the East Pacific, and it's likely going to limit how strong it can get. And you can see on this Hurricane Center forecast, it's not forecast to become a hurricane until, say, Friday. And as it does so, the 26-degree isotherm runs about like this, so it's not likely to get all too strong on the current forecast because it crosses that into cooler seasonal temperatures fairly quickly after becoming a hurricane. So that's going to be its limitation on Tropical Depression 3. But for our next system, that's not going to be an issue. As you can see, this development area is well east of where Tropical Depression 3 is. And assuming models are correct and it's going to be forming, say, around here, this leaves a whole lot more real estate for the system to develop into a hurricane. And given the warm waters that we have here and the upper level environment we have, we could easily get a major hurricane out of this. And I wouldn't be surprised if, some model depictions like the GFS are true, where it intensifies at, potentially at a category 4 before it reaches the more stable environment northwest. And that could easily rack up some ace points, maybe getting us closer to average here in the East Pacific. But I think even though we have this, we'll still stay below average. But a good bit of activity, and the good news is here, like I said earlier, none of these are impacting land. These are mainly just shipping interests, and we're not going to be looking at any of these turning into Mexico and making landfall. Usually this time of year you have storms going west here out to sea away from the Mexican coastline. So that's good news there. All right, now we're going to move off towards the Atlantic as we have a broad tropical wave over the Leeward Islands today. This system is not well developed at all. It's been struggling with some dry air, and I don't have a floater on this. This is the best we're going to get really for a close-up view of the entire wave. But you can see the general flow pattern around it. We've got a broad area of southeasterly flow on the east side of it, turning into northeasterly flow just north of Puerto Rico. So that outlines a wave axis probably about like that, centered maybe over the U.S. or British Virgin Islands right now, if you were to pinpoint a center on that wave. Now, you'll notice that the system is not really all too organized in convection. You can see it a little bit better here on this Caribbean view. We just have a lot of sporadic convective bursts going off. Nothing organized all too much. Now, this is an effect of the system dealing with a lot of dry air over the past few days. You might be able to pick it out north of the system. There's a little bit of a brown tinge of still remaining Saharan air that came right over the system as it was moving east or moving west. And over the past few days, it's been completely void of convection almost entirely because of this dry air. Now, yesterday we started to see the system fire little mini convective bursts. And while those did die down pretty quickly because of the dry air, what they did do is they lofted some moisture from the ocean up into the atmosphere and allowed the atmospheric column to become more moist. And now we're seeing the effects of that as we're getting now a more efficient process today of more convection being able to fire here over the wave. Now, this is a gradual process. Like I said, I studied yesterday, and we're probably going to be seeing this sporadic nature of convection continue the next couple of days as it tracks further west. But eventually, the idea is that this will be able to moisten the environment enough to where it's able to blow up convection to be more sustaining over a concentrated area of low pressure away from the sporadic nature that we're seeing today. Now, this is good news for the Caribbean islands as we're not seeing really any odds of tropical development as the system moves through your area. You can see in the Leeward Islands getting into Puerto Rico today. Odds of development in the next 2 days is about 0% from the National Hurricane Center. And I'd be inclined to agree with that, as this is not the look of a developing tropical cyclone. What you want is that convection to be more concentrated into a low pressure system. And just given the current environments with still some dry air in there, it's not going to be overly likely to happen, at least for the next couple of days. Now, as the system comes west, like I said, it's going to be more favorable moisture-wise as this convection continues to blow up, and development odds do rise pretty quickly as you get further west here into the Bahamas and towards the southeastern United States, as the environment is forecast to be fairly favorable for that development. Although there are a couple of uncertainties that are still within the question realm here, as we're still in this questioning phase of what may happen with this wave. One issue which is common for storms that track through this area of the world is how far north or south is it going to track over the next few days. We've had divergence in model solutions. For example, the European model, which has tracked this continuously north of Hispaniola and Cuba and through the Bahamas, and allows it to develop in some cases east of Florida. And you end up with, by Saturday or Sunday, a tropical storm off the coast of Miami. On the other hand, we've had models like the GFS being consistent of bringing the system right over Hispaniola and then right over Cuba. So it really doesn't develop until it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. And even then, we've had some model runs struggle to develop the system at all in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we're kind of in this questioning phase. How far north or south is it going to be exactly when it tracks through, say, Hispaniola? Now, one thing we can look at is we can look at the initialization from these models and see, which one's right. So this is for 18Z Wednesday, which is about the time that I'm recording this. We can see on both the GFS and the European appears to be a little bit further north with the extent of the wave axis. You can see we have this more pronounced curve further north than the GFS does on this model. And if we look at this compared to where we are today, if we look again at the European, I want to get a general sense of where that is. So it's about east of the central Turks and Caicos. If we look at this on the real-time imagery, we do have what appears to be some curvature in the winds this far north like the European shows. And they both do show the center about where it is today. So maybe this is an indication that the European is a bit more right today, but only time will tell. And what I'm really going to be watching for over the next day is where is it when it comes to Hispaniola over the next day. So if I do make a video tomorrow, we'll be looking at, okay, where is it in terms of Hispaniola? Is it where the GFS wants? Is it right over the landmass? Or is it where, say, the European wants it, and we still have part of the wave a little bit north of Hispaniola? At that point, I think we can start to uncover a few questions that we have today still remaining, and we can start to get a little bit more confident in what's actually going to happen once the system comes west. Now, the impacts of whatever happens here are pretty clear. If the system does stay north of Hispaniola like the European has, it has more ocean time, and this could allow the system to develop earlier in the track. You could see it developing into a sharper wave axis, and this has, like I said on a few runs from the European, developed into a tropical storm off the eastern Florida coastline. But on the GFS, because it interacts with land a lot more, we don't actually see development until it gets into the Gulf of Mexico, and it only develops right up along the coastline here of the Florida Panhandle. Now, we do also have some difficulty with the steering pattern over the United States, and this is also highly dependent on exactly where it goes, north or south in the short term. Let's take it one at a time. Let's look at the European model as it's coming into the northern Bahamas. If we look at the steering pattern over the United States, we've got this trough digging in over the southeastern United States. So we have this digging in. We've got a ridge here over Bermuda. We've got a ridge here over the western United States. So we have this break in between. Our system is here. So this system is going to want to come north. And this happens on both models, I should say. Now, one thing that's important is exactly how far east or west it is. The European being further east allows the system to get caught by this trough more effectively, because this trough is not the type of trough to come in here and sit around for a few days. By Monday morning, this is already moving out, and we're already getting rebuilding from ridging in the southern United States. So by this time, the system being further east on the model is able to be caught by this trough more effectively, and it ends up going out to sea on this forecast. Now, of course, this does have some sensitivity. How fast does this ridge build in? Does that allow it to come right into the Carolinas? Or is it, take a little bit weaker? Is this trough a little bit stronger and allows the system to fully stay offshore? That's a little bit of uncertainty with the European solution. But the difficulty with this is where the GFS solution comes in. As I touched on, the GFS is back here over the Florida Panhandle. And the implications of this is further west and further south. It's in a bit of a tighter spot for this trough to catch it. And what we end up with as this trough departs fairly quickly, this ridge further west builds in over the southern United States. And you'll see if we go back to the GFS model, it comes into the Florida Panhandle, but this ridge is already rebuilding. And so now you're getting flow pushing it back south into the Gulf of Mexico, and we end up with this storm that's just stalling here in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. And I don't need to tell you why this is a bad scenario, because we could get a lot of rainfall from this. But also, we've had different solutions from the GFS on this. We've had solutions where it stalls here off of the Florida coastline. We've had solutions where it stalls here off of Louisiana. And we've even had solutions where it gets caught earlier by the ridge and ends up tracking west across the entire Gulf of Mexico and ends up making landfall potentially in western Louisiana. Now, I think the most likely scenario here, if this does come true like the GFS shows, would be more here in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, but it's still something to keep an eye on in the western and central Gulf of Mexico, just in case something does come your way. But this could also be an issue because you'll see on the model this does intensify some when it comes back over the Gulf of Mexico. And we've seen some potential from the GFS that if this does get caught enough to where it's, say, over the Gulf of Mexico, the upper level environment may be just favorable for this system to intensify before making landfall in the United States along the Gulf Coast. And this is an extremely sensitive situation, as you can imagine, because we have, like I said, some scenarios where the system goes out to sea harmlessly, not impacting really any of the United States. And then we have solutions where the system comes in, maybe as a weak tropical storm and weakens over land, but still brings a lot of rainfall. And then we have other solutions where it gets into the Gulf of Mexico and it stays over water long enough to be able to intensify some before making an eventual landfall here in the United States at some point. Now, it's pointless to go into, exactly which one I speculate to be correct. It's unknown exactly which one is going to happen. And one thing to keep in mind is that while the GFS has been consistent on showing a scenario like this, it's also had runs in between where it hasn't developed into a tropical storm. And there's still a lot up in the air for this system. So if you're seeing runs on social media that's saying big hurricane coming for the Gulf Coast next week, don't pay too much attention to that as, like full forecast confidence. It's still possible, it's within the overall realm of possibility out of the system, but it's not an imminent threat and it's nothing to panic over. But it is an important reminder, and I've said this before and I'll keep saying it. We're now July 31st. We're getting into August. This is getting into peak season. You need to have your hurricane preparedness kit ready just in case a storm does come your way. Whether that's this system or a storm later down the road, you want to be prepared as we go through peak season, as signs are that we're going to be getting into an active period here as we go into mid to late August, and I have a feeling that will not stop once we get into September, and we'll be having lots of storms, as we usually do, active at once in the Atlantic. You can see the uncertainty range here in the NHC Tropical Weather Outlook. You can see they've highlighted this system with a 60% chance of development, which seems about right. I don't know if I'd go high chance just yet, just given the uncertainties with land interaction, but right now 50-60% looks about right. And you can see they have these uncertainties that I mentioned outlined with potential for the system to go out to sea, but also potential for the system to come to the Gulf of Mexico. And this is certainly something to pay close attention to, especially if you're in the southeastern United States, mainly Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, as the system does develop. But of course, even if this system does not develop, we could still be looking at a lot of disturbed weather moving across this entire region of the basin, and we could be looking at some localized flooding issues, especially in areas like Hispaniola and Cuba, which has higher terrain with those thunderstorms moving over those mountains. Now, it's been a very long video, but I'll touch on one last thing. I mentioned that we're forecast to go into a more active period as we go into August. You can see this on the current outlook from the Climate Prediction Center. This is their long-range tropical weather outlook. It's about 3 weeks, and you can see they've highlighted 2 areas over the next couple of weeks with about 40% chance of development here in the MDR of the Atlantic, which shows that we could have tropical waves coming offshore and developing into a favorable environment. And you know what could happen. Hopefully we get these systems tracking out to sea, but with the steering pattern that we have this year, this could easily come west into the Caribbean, and we could be looking at systems, several systems over the next couple of months moving through these areas. So make sure you're prepared for peak season, and I'll have my updated forecast in the next week as we look towards peak season. That's all that I've got for today. Stay safe as our tropical wave from the Atlantic moves through. And I'll have more videos, likely not tomorrow, but as we go into more parts of the week, into the weekend, as all of our systems in East Pacific and the Atlantic progress. That's all that I've got for today. Thanks for watching.